telephone line is legendary musician who has collaborated with greats such as Bob Dylan, John Sebastian, and others. Folk music pioneer, the great Happy Traum. Happy, it is an honor to have you with me on KMET Radio.
Thanks, Brian. Good to be here.
Happy, you are considered a New York folk music legend. How did you find an interest in folk music?
I found my way into folk music when I was in high school, and that goes back so far that it was like not quite before the Civil War. It was actually in the 1950s, early 50s, and it was really through seeing Pete Seeger for the first time in a concert in Brooklyn, and it just kind of turned my mind to a whole other thing. I'd only heard pop music on the radio, and I never thought I could participate in that music because it was all done in a studio with orchestras and big productions and very famous singers, people that were household names. But he was this guy that I had not heard of before, Pete Seeger, just standing on a stage all by himself with a banjo and about 1,500 people, mostly young people, and they were singing along to these songs that I never had heard before, a lot of them, and I just was captivated by it.
Who were some of your big music influences prior to Pete Seeger early in your career? Were you a Beatles fan, Elvis fan?
The first people that I was influenced by besides Pete?
Right.
I was listening to Woody Guthrie, blues people like Big Bill Broonzy and Leadbelly, Josh White, people who really knew how to play the guitar and sing, and many of the people that were from the either blues or the Appalachian music traditions that were recording then. And then I discovered in New York City, where I was living at the time, there was a whole cadre of young people that were into this kind of music. And we would get together on a Sunday in Greenwich Village in Washington Square Park and sing together, and we just learned songs from each other and learned guitar picking from each other and all that stuff, and it was a great time. And some of those people went on to become really famous in the music world, and some of them just went on to other aspects of life that did not bring them fame, but they were people that I've remained friendly with to this day.
Now, Happy, I have to ask you, how did you get your first big break into the business?
Well, I never really had a big break. I sort of went about it in a very small grassroots way. I guess the first thing that happened that got me any notoriety was I joined a group in the early 50s called the New World Singers, and this new guy who had just come to town not long before, by the name of Bob Dylan, was a big fan of our music, and we became friends with him. And so we went into a studio with my hero, Pete Seeger, and this other new guy named Phil Oakes, and a whole bunch of other people, and Bob Dylan was there as well, and we made the first recording of Blowing in the Wind that was ever done. Bob had given the group the lyrics and sang the melody for us that he wanted us to do, and we learned it and started playing it in the clubs around New York, and that gave us the distinction of being the first, but not the best known. Of course, Peter, Paul, and Mary then made a recording of it, and that just swept the country. So that you couldn't call it a big break, but it was a nice little bump up in our in the notoriety. And then sort of being a journeyman player around the village and other places, going to Philly and Boston and playing in folk clubs. And I also was a guitar teacher. I taught at guitar camps. I got a following that way. And then in the latter part of the 1960s, my younger brother Artie and I started forming a duo, and he was a superbly talented guitar player and songwriter and singer. And we came to the attention of Albert Grossman, who was Bob Dylan's manager and also managed Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Janis Joplin, and Richie Havens, and Tom Rush. I mean, it just goes on and on. He had just about the biggest group of clientele of anybody in the music business back in the late 60s and into the 70s. Everybody knew him. And he liked us and took us on, and so he got us a contract with Capitol Records, and we made two albums for Capitol, and then went on the road with many of his groups sort of as an opening act, which got us a lot of publicity. Not a lot of money, but it got us a lot of publicity. So we went out on the road with the band several times, with the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, Gordon Lightfoot, people like that, and got to play a lot of great places.
Now, Happy, you mentioned Bob Dylan. The record "You Ain't Going Nowhere," I believe there was a 1967 version, if I'm not mistaken. But in the 1971 version, it's actually you and Dylan together. Is that correct?
Right. Well, I met Bob in New York City in around 1962, which was just shortly after he arrived in the city. And we were friends in New York, and he and his then-girlfriend, Susie Rotolo, and my wife and I spent some time with them, and Bob used to come to our New World Singers shows when we played at the Bitter End or the Gertie's Folk City or the Gaslight Cafe, those places around New York. And then when his star rose and he had all those, started playing bigger and bigger places, we kind of lost touch with him. But around 1966, we had decided to move to Woodstock, New York, get out of the city. We had 3 young kids, so we moved up to the country where Bob was living, and Albert Grossman and a lot of other people were living in this community, which is an artist community, about 100 miles north of New York City, and kind of renewed my friendship with Bob. At this point, he was off the road because he had his motorcycle accident. So for several years, we just got together as friends and played together, and he was not touring. He's not doing much in the way of interviews or anything. He was pretty much just staying at home. And then one day, to my surprise, he just said, "Can you come down to New York and meet me at the Columbia Studios, and I just want to cut a few songs and, just bring you a guitar and a banjo and a bass." So I did. I took the bus down from Woodstock to New York and went over to the studio, and it was just Bob and me and an engineer, and we cut at least 4 songs together, and it was just as if we were sitting around our living room playing. There wasn't too much difference. It was very informal. We did maybe 2 or 3 takes at the most of each song, sometimes only 1 take. And then to my great surprise, it came out on his Greatest Hits Volume 2.
That's amazing. We're speaking to the great Happy Traum. Yeah, now, Happy, on that song, the Byrds also created a version, if I'm not mistaken, in 1968. And the version that I like best is the one that you did with Dylan in 71.
You're talking about You Ain't Going Nowhere?
Yeah. Because I believe the Byrds did a
Bob's
version.
idea for getting me in the studio was to record songs that other people had hits with, but he hadn't. And he wanted to put his own personal stamp on those songs. So when we did You Ain't Going Nowhere, I knew that from the Basement tapes, which he had done in Woodstock with members of the band a few years previous. So when I went in with him, I wasn't referencing the Byrds version, and Bob kind of made up new words as he went along. He was just sort of, I don't even remember if they were written down. I think he was just making them up out of his head, and he referenced McGuinn, who, of course, was the lead singer in the Byrds and probably brought that song to the group, and he remained a friend of Roger McGuinn's, and some other verses that he just kind of threw in off the top of his head. And then when I sing the song, I only sing it Bob's that way. I don't sing the Byrds version just because I never learned it that way.
Right. But I definitely like the 71 version so much better. We have a cut, Happy, of Just for the Love of It.
Okay.
And I want to play a couple of minutes of it, okay? And that's from your latest CD, correct?
Yes. The song you have is with John Sebastian on harmonica?
Yes, with the harp. Just for the Love of It. That's from your latest CD.
Right, and I have Byron Isaacs on bass, who's now with the Lumineers, and Jerry Murata, who's a really legendary drummer, is playing drums on that. So it's a great little group.
All right, we have a couple of minutes. Sean, can you play a couple of minutes of that?
Love, oh love, they call it careless love. I said love, oh careless love. Love, love, they call it careless love. Don't you see what careless love has done? What it do? Well, it made me weep, made me moan. Careless love made me weep, made me moan. Careless love made me weep, made this poor boy moan. It made me lose my happy home.
That's a track from your latest CD. It's called Just for the Love of It.
Right.
It's a great song. And just let the public know if they wanted to purchase your latest CD, where can they go?
Yeah, that was made just a couple of years ago in Woodstock with some really good friends, Larry Campbell and Teresa Williams, who you might know, John Sebastian, of course, Byron Isaacs, David Amram, who's a legendary multi-instrumentalist, who's now about 87 or 88 years old, but still going strong. He played with everybody. He's just from Leonard Bernstein to Jack Kerouac. He's amazing. So it's a pretty varied record, although it's pretty much based on American folk music, which is what I've loved all my life. Blues, folk songs. I have one Dylan song. I always have at least one Dylan song on one of my CDs, and this one I did. It's called "Down in the Flood," which actually is one of the songs I played with him on his Greatest Hits Volume 2. So I kind of brought it back around to that. Guys of that caliber. It's just terrific. It makes great music.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask you, it must be great playing with John Sebastian there. John Sebastian on harp, is that correct?
Yeah, in this case he's on harp. He's also plays guitar on a couple of things. John happens to be one of my closest friends. He lives here in Woodstock. I've known him since, I met him first when he was with the Love and Spoonful, and that was in New York City, and then I didn't really know him very well, but when he moved to Woodstock, we became friends probably from the mid-'70s till now, and we see each other very frequently and probably play together at least a couple of times a year. And he's on just about all this. Most of the records I've made, he's on my solo records. He's a wonderful guy and a really, really good musician, and he's just always adds so much to a recording session or a performance. I should throw in this little plug. Every year here in Woodstock, New York, we do what we call a winter solstice concert. This year it's going to be on December 14th. And this will be our 20th year of doing it. I started it with my brother back in the late 90s, and he passed away in 2008. So we continue the tradition, and we have some really fantastic musicians on the show. Usually it's Amy Helm, who's Levon's daughter, is on the show with us. Jeff Muldor is often there. Larry Campbell sometimes. It's a kind of a movable feast, but we always have about 7 or 8 or 9 really great musicians playing with us. And so if anybody's around or wants to come to Woodstock on December 14th, I would just say get your tickets in advance. It's at the Woodstock Playhouse, which is one of our premier venues in Woodstock. But it always sells out, so just so you know.
Yeah, if you want to mention your website for the public.
Yeah, I have 2 websites. One is for me personally, which is happytraum.com, and usually I list, to the best of my ability, the places where I'll be playing, in the near future. And then the homespun.com is a much bigger website. That's my company, which my wife Jane and I started 52 years ago. And we have it's all guitar or other related instruments, instruction, with some really great artists. And actually we have guitar, banjo, mandolin, piano, drums, and we have artists like Dr. John teaching piano, or Donald Fagen teaching piano, or Sam Bush teaching mandolin, and Tony Rice on guitar. We have a huge amount of probably 600 different lessons that you can download or stream or get a hold of in one way, or buy the physical DVDs in most cases. So that's homespun.com. And it's a lot of fun to browse through that and see all the different lessons we've got on that.
And Happy, your best, I have to ask you, the best concert, the best venue you ever performed in, and why?
Oh, that would be a hard question. I think maybe I'll say in about 1968, I think it was, we opened for the band in Central Park right after Music from Big Pink came out, and it was a huge crowd, and they loved us. What can I say? We had a small band, my brother and I, and a couple of other musicians, and we did a set, and people are still coming up to me to this day and telling me how much they enjoyed that. And we became friends with members of the band and knew them all during their lifetimes. So that's a memorable one. That's one that just pops into my mind. But another one is a more recent one, the last Solstice concert we did last December. It was just also a memorable concert with many of the people I mentioned to you, with John Sebastian and Jeff Muldar and Amy Helm and Cindy Cashdollar on dobro, and Eric Parker on drums, and Byron Isaac on bass. I mean, that's just a fun night of music, and that one also stands out in my mind.
Yeah, now I have to ask you, Happy, my final question. We didn't speak much about the duo with your brother, Happy and Artie.
Right.
How did that idea form? How did the duo form, Happy and Artie?
Right. Well, we used to play together as kids. He was 5 years younger than me, so I had to wait for him to grow up before we could play together. But around I moved to Woodstock in 1967, and he moved to Woodstock the following year, and it just was a natural thing for us to start playing and writing songs together. And we started playing around in New York, around the Village, and around Woodstock and other places, and that's when Albert Grossman picked us up and got us a contract with Capitol Records, and we played together on and off for about 40 years until his passing in 2008, but really full-time until about 1975. But we did things together all through the years. We had a radio show on WAMC in Albany for several years. We played a lot of major festivals. We toured in Europe, in Japan. So we had a lot of fun together and made a lot of good music.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate a few minutes, Happy, and we'll mention your website. It's happytraum.com, and on the website it lists your upcoming shows. There's a scrapbook page,
right.
Your latest blog. There's video lessons, right?
Yep. That's
and
right.
there's links to certain links to your career sites, I believe.
Right,
and so it's happytraum.com. There's also the other site, as you mentioned, home. Can you say it again? Homespun.com?
Homespun, yes. HOMESPUN. Homespun.com. And it's got maybe 600 different lessons by myself and over 200 other musicians who teach their styles, techniques, experience. And it's for beginners to advanced players. We have something for everybody.
It's great, and I appreciate a few minutes, but I appreciate your time coming on to the program.
Okay. My pleasure, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. That was the legendary Happy Traum, and we'll mention his website again, happytraum.com. You could see his upcoming shows, scrapbook page on Happy, and some of his friends. And you got to check out the 1971 version of You Ain't Going Nowhere. It's my favorite version, and that's Bob Dylan and Happy Traum together. And it's a great song. As we mentioned here, the Byrds actually did it in 1968, and Dylan did it in 67. The one that I like is the 1971 version with Happy Traum and Bob Dylan. And next week we will have another legendary guest scheduled to be on the program. I thank you all for tuning in, and until next week, happy collecting to all.